Hello and welcome here in the European Parliament on the third floor in VoxBox number 1 to the second episode of EUJS TV. Again, we have a group here with us in Brussels that we were happy to welcome. This time it's a group of 15 young activists that do currently a gap year with J Academy. And together we try to explore the bubble, the political bubble of Brussels. And again, we didn't leave one stone unturned in order to bring together an interesting and fascinating panel in order to discuss pressing questions that we built up together here as a group. With us here today are Alfiaz Vaiya, who is the current coordinator of the Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup. He holds this position ever since 2015. But also was before involved in various NGOs, both in London and Brussels, in order to, advocate for civil rights. He holds an LLB from Leeds Metropolitan University and a master's degree in international relations from the University of Birmingham. Right next to him, to my left, is MEP Peter Niedermüller, also a very good friend of EUJS, if I might say so. MEP Peter Niedermüller was born in Hungary. He studied cultural anthropology and also taught for more than 20 years at Humboldt University in my very own hometown, Berlin. Peter Niedermüller is a member of the European Parliament ever since 2014. He is a member of the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, and also a member of the Delegation for Relations with Israel. He also is involved with many other committees as a substitute, mostly focusing on budgetary control, money laundering, tax avoidance, tax evasion, and also the EU-Albanian relations. Last but certainly not least, to my right, is Alina Bricman. Alina Bricman, originally from Romania, holds a master's degree in political science from the Central European University in Budapest. She got involved with EUJS as a volunteer. 1 year ago, she has various experiences in non-formal education, mostly through Sarvash. For those of you who don't know that word, Google it. It's one of these Jewish programs you should know. Alina just started recently to work with us here in Brussels as part of the EUJS team. 2 months ago, she joined us as our new programs officer. Thank you all very much for being here with us today. It's a great pleasure to also have such a diverse panel with many different positions that are being held here in Brussels. And I would suggest we just dive into our discussion right away in order to not waste any further time. I will start with you, Alina. Alina, you started your position here in Brussels 2 months ago. All of this is still very new for you, and obviously there must be many new impressions here that you have to deal with also. And we'd be interested in getting to know A, what is it you're doing, but B, also what brought you to Brussels? What was your driving motivation in order to get active here in Brussels?
Okay, so I will start with the second part of the question. What brought me here to Brussels? My first involvement with EUJS was very unexpected and somewhat random. I had heard of a summer program which seemed very fun, and I decided to join the team. And ever since, I just felt that it's a place that really leaves a lot of space for youth to get involved in whatever way that they feel suits them best and to bring in whatever they feel their most relevant contribution might be. So ever since, I constantly expressed my desire to stay involved with EUJS and not lose touch. And EUJS really opened a room for me to act as a volunteer whenever something was going on in Budapest. And oftentimes, there are a lot of seminars happening there. So I was getting involved, speaking on behalf of EUJS on certain occasions. After that, the program officer position opened up, and it was definitely something that just clicked. I applied the minute I saw it, and happily I made the cut.
Yeah, definitely, we're happy too. But how does Brussels feel for you? I mean, it's a new city. It's a very vital city, as we know, and a city with I mean, politics is basically all around. So how does that feel? How was your first impression of the city?
Well, first of all, my impression, unlike most people in the EU bubble, was very positive in terms of what Brussels has to offer as a city for its locals. So I think it's a great place to live in and a great environment to experience as someone who lives here, regardless of what their work might be.
Sure.
And then in terms of the European institutions, it's definitely very impressive for someone who comes here as a young graduate who hasn't really been in touch with this world before. And at the same time, I feel it's a very inviting environment where people are very open to talking to young students who have a lot of questions. And in my experience, in my very limited experience so far, everyone has been definitely very, very welcoming.
Thank you very much. I hope that our group shares the same first impression of Brussels. Obviously, this is, for many, this is the first time in the European Parliament. So I really hope that we could also, deliver that message to the people visiting us here. Peter, well, your political career started, I think, a little longer ago than only 2 years ago. But I mean, you're also new to Brussels in a sense, as this is your first term as a European Parliament. But maybe also to project the question onto you, we'd be interested in getting to know how and why did you become a politician, and how did your political career also start? And then secondly also, how does it feel? How does it look like from your chair? How does it look like as an MEP? How is the discussion culture? Are people working with each other? Are people helpful? That would be interesting for us to get to know.
I mean, first of all, my political career started maybe in the beginning, in the 2000 years, when after being, I don't know how many years on the university, I had the feeling I have to change my life a little bit, because, to teach in the university is very exciting all the time, but sometimes it becomes a kind of routine. And that was the one point. And the other point is I had the feeling somehow that we have to try to change the world a little bit, And if you are a university professor, of course, you can change a lot of things. But if you are a politician, maybe you can change a little bit more. That was the one point. The second point is, of course, that in Hungary, we had really a very, very difficult time during the last 10 years. And I thought maybe it would be important to try to change a little bit the political culture and the political arena in my country. And that was the second point. And I was thinking, okay, maybe I try to do that. And Brussels, the European Parliament is really a kind of, how to say that, the world in small, so many different countries, so many different cultures. But I think the most important point is the common wish to bring Europe forward. I think it's really not just a kind of slogan. This is really a political ambition to bring together the European countries. And just now, you will see probably on the same way than I do, that just now the political situation is really very, very dangerous. I don't need to talk a lot about the rising far-right populism everywhere in Europe. As I think so, the European Parliament is an absolutely proper place to do something against that. Of course, we have populists in the parliament as well, and we have a lot of fight with them. But I think so this is the exact place where we can explain for the people that nation state is not everything, and nationalism is absolutely the wrong way, and just to build walls and fences is absolutely the wrong way. So we need an open and inclusive society, and I think so. If you want, you can really work in the European Parliament for an open and inclusive society, and this is for me an absolutely crucial point.
You hold the position of the treasurer of the S&D group. I didn't even mention that, of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. How does, I mean, we have the position of a treasurer also within EUJS and obviously within various NGOs, but how does that look like for a party, and then even a European party?
I think so. This is on the one side is of course just a kind of administrative and bureaucratic way, and everybody say, "Oh my God, you are the treasurer! How boring is it?" But on the other side, this is a huge responsibility, because the money we work with here in the Parliament, this is the money of the taxpayer, of the European taxpayer. This is public money. This is not my money and not your money. So I think so it's very important that we use this money in a proper way. We use this money for the future of the Europe, European countries for education, for example, for culture, for peace. So I think so. The one thing is, as I told you, this bureaucratic part of that. But on the other side, this is very important. This is really a political responsibility. How do you go with that money? What are you going to do with that? And I think so. It's an important point.
Thank you very much, Peter. Alfie, last but certainly not least again. So you came from an NGO background and you basically switched sides. You are now working for the parliament but still involved with NGOs. Could you maybe explain how that way then went, and then also maybe already start speaking a little bit about the work you do today and about the intergroup that you're coordinating?
First of all, I want to thank EUJS and also Peter Niedermüller for the hard work they do to fight racism. I did start working for an NGO and in another NGO in Brussels, and I was very used to lobbying MEPs and assistants, but I felt like I wanted to do something from the other side. Often, I think with NGOs, sometimes we're doing a lot of advocacy work, but we don't feel like we're getting much done, and we're waiting for the responses of members of parliament and their assistants. So when I was offered the opportunity to come and work inside of the parliament for the Intergroup, I couldn't say no. And I felt like I could make a bigger difference from working inside, actually, amending legislation, holding events, raising awareness. In particular, what we're doing in the Parliament, I represent a grouping of members of European Parliament, of which Peter's a member of the Intergroup. And we're basically working in the Parliament to fight racism and promote diversity. So we're working with various groups, various NGOs on a variety of issues, anti-Semitism being one, but Islamophobia, anti-Gypsyism, LGBTI rights, gender rights. And we're working with these groups to, one, build coalitions amongst the groups, but second of all, to get their voices heard in the Parliament. I think often many NGOs, and I've worked in NGOs, a concern is that the European Parliament, the European institutions are inaccessible to NGOs. And one of the main things I want to do in my role, and I was given the mandate by my MEPs, was to actually, make sure that the voices of NGOs are heard inside, the voices of communities are heard inside, but also the voices of youth. Because it is true that, if you look at demographics, we're an aging population, and it's going to be the youth that are going to be driving our economic growth, but also driving the kind of societies we want to live in. So if we don't have the voices of the youth and we don't have the youth on board, we're going to wake up to a nasty reality tomorrow that, we haven't considered the kind of Europe we want to be in. And more importantly, I think in our work, where it's very important is that, we do write a lot of amendments to legislation and to reports. And it's important to hear what the communities themselves need. I mean, what is right for a community? Because sitting in my office in the European Parliament in this vast building, I'm also a little bit detached from the everyday realities of what's happening in the communities. So when we're amending important legislation, for example, on migration or in the fight against anti-Semitism or racism, we need to make sure that the legislation we're amending and we're having is meeting the needs of the communities and the groups directly affected. And so for that, we need to make sure we ensure the voices of the communities are heard inside of the Parliament.
And I can say that, the two of you were insanely, or are insanely helpful in ensuring that. It was you, Mr. Peter Niedermüller, who helped us bring this group in here. You, Alfie, and your intergroup are the reason also for why we can, again, have this wonderful studio. This time it's even VoxBox #1 and not VoxBox #3. But speaking of youth voices and of youth activism, so we agree that there's a necessity to bring youth voices to the Parliament. And I think that recent elections have also shown the importance of assuring that these voices are being heard, because apparently there's a huge gap between what older parts of the society and younger parts of society think. And not only Brexit showed that, also just yesterday we had the elections in Austria, and if I'm correct, also there was a huge gap, not only a gender gap with regard to who people voted for, but also, again, an age gap. So what I'd be interested in maybe hearing now, and it's also very fascinating that we have the youth activist, the former NGO, now European expert, and the MEP voice in order to hear about that. So what role does youth play? What role do youth voices play with regard to upholding the European idea? Where do you see the mission of youth? And also maybe concerning your own experience and your own work, how have youth voices contributed to the everyday work you do? for the activist part, this is pretty much your job. But even there, I think you could, it would be interesting to hear also concrete examples of how youth activism can change the agenda. Shall we maybe start with you again, Alina?
Well, maybe I would point out two things. I think oftentimes young people are a bit turned off by the idea of engaging in politics because it often involves these very broad ideologies and these very broad narratives that for someone in a very fast-paced life are not interesting. And I think for young people, politics is much more single-issue oriented. And I think that's fine, and people should embrace that. And the fact that they're only interested in particular issues should not discourage them to participate, but the contrary. I think, if you're interested in this little niche, this is the contribution that you should feel invited to make. The second thing I would point out is that there is this incredibly widespread discourse where the establishment is somehow always demonized. And activists fight against the establishment, and the opposition goes against the establishment. And oftentimes, of course, this is very justified, and the things that are being fought against are very important. But at the same time, I think that this creates a very, very negative disengagement with politics, and I think it's important to on the long run, try to see the establishment as a partner and as someone that, especially as a young person, you should be in dialogue with or part of as an end game, probably. This being said, maybe on a more positive note, with all the negative results in a lot of elections, I would call them negative, we still see a majority.
Most of us would agree with that, definitely.
Youth voices have generally not taken the same direction as the entire result, and I think that's an important thing to point out.
Thank you, Alina. And then now going from the activist perspective to the MEP perspective. So how would you see the role, the contribution of youth voices to European politics as someone sitting in the parliament?
I am absolutely convinced that this is an absolutely crucial issue to have more political activity from the younger generation everywhere in Europe. So if it's in a frame of an NGO or any other kind of social movement or civil movement, this is the one thing. And the other thing is, of course, party politics. And this is very important to say that the big European parties, they lose their members, because the younger generation, they look for new forms of political participation. And I absolutely agree with that. But on the other part, we have political parties, and political parties need members and need people who are ready to take over this responsibility. So I would argue that politics is not necessarily a dirty business. It is partly, of course,
despite the fact that you work as a treasurer.
Not a dirty business. And of course, you as a politician, you can change a lot in local milieus, in social milieus, in European milieus. And therefore, we absolutely need young people. Also here in the parliament, we have very, very few young parliamentarians, young MEPs, and we need much more. And we need much more young members in the politics, in the political parties. Because if you say that the politics is a dirty business, if the political parties are a part of the establishment and the elite and everything is bad, then the only way to change it, to move into the parties and to take over the power. And I think so that's absolutely important. But on the other side, I absolutely agree with you what you mentioned. To be part or to work in an NGO, to work in a social movement, any kind, is absolutely crucial. And it can be a kind of introductory part before you go to the politics. So I think so the worst thing would be when the younger generation would not interest for politics. I think so it's very important that you stay active in the politics and you say we have to change everything. And after that you will say maybe you can change a little bit, but you have to say we would like to change everything.
Afi,
what can I say after these two interventions? I would say one thing, three things, but one thing in particular. We in this House and politicians have to take responsibility for the lack of youth engagement. The rhetoric at European level, the rhetoric at member state level is unacceptable. It's putting off a lot of youth from engaging. And where you see popular uprisings, I mean, I look at Podemos in Spain, and Syriza, how it was in Greece, these are the movements the youth are reaching out to. And why are they reaching out to them? Because they understand social media. They understand how to get the message out. And of course, it's easier for these movements to make those messages because they're saying something you could call populist, but something that's, against the establishment. So their message resonates with, youth who are unemployed, like, for example, in the Mediterranean. And so I think we need to know in this house how to change our rhetoric and how to make this place more welcoming so youth can feel comfortable, because youth have to understand that it's the decisions we make here, the decisions we make in the European Commission, the European External Action Service, directly affect the youth. They affect the current generation and the future generations. Mm-hmm. The two things I would criticize the youth on, I would say this, is that none of us on this table have lived through the dark times. I mean, really, we didn't experience what happened during the Holocaust. Some people's families may have. We don't know what the hard times are. So we're sort of, we're guilty because, we've been living in this peaceful society, most of us. And so we've experienced its calm and we've seen the European Union exist and we don't know what's at stake. And that's the message we have to get out, that actually there's a lot at stake. Peter rightly mentions that, we see populists in this parliament. I think we have about 50 to 100 members of parliament who belong to the far right. And, our moderate parties are also, in rhetoric changing that way. And I think the youth need to realize that what's at stake, because there's a lot at stake. I mean, I'm seeing it every day with the worsening situation, the amount of complaints we're receiving. And I think there we have to address the lack of political participation of youth in politics and in when it comes to voting. I mean, the one thing I would say, I was from the UK, I was disappointed with Brexit, but a lot of my young friends were also disappointed with the result. But how many of them went to vote? It was one thing coming out of the election, and I saw a lot of Facebook posts and a lot of Twitter posts blaming the elder generation, as though the elder generation had messed it up for the youth. Mm-hmm. But how much of the youth went out to vote? We can't and that's the thing the youth need to understand, that you can't blame everyone else for your problems. If you want to make a difference, then you have to go out and get engaged in politics, mm-hmm. and you have to make the change you want to see. And that's why European Union of Jewish Students is very effective, because you bring youth to the parliament, and you also do a lot of work that talks about the needs of in particular Jewish young men and women, but also Roma, also Muslim, also LGBTI. So I think that's the direction we need to go in, and we need to see how we can change the rhetoric around here to make it more appealing for youth to become engaged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. It's actually interesting also that the two of you again mentioned the far right. Let me just share a little story that happened to our group. About 20 minutes ago, we were just next to the studio trying to prepare for this session, and Beatrix von Storch, the head of the German AfD party here, which is a far-right party, took a few pictures, and I think we are all quite amused. The public reaction I got, the tone I got from our group was a sense of amusement, but at the same time, these people walk around free here, and they have obviously every right to voice their opinion, but in a sense they threat the existence of the European Union, and they are part of this very building, and this is sometimes very important to understand, that it's not a joke anymore, right? It's a part of our reality. But okay, this being said, we spoke now a lot about youth activism. We spoke a lot about youth involvement, and we spoke about how we got here. What I'd be interested to hear now, maybe what we'd be interested, it's very important to mention that again, these questions were built up by our group. What we'd be interested in hearing, maybe as a last round, would be 2 points. A, why and how are minority voices then of crucial importance for the European narrative? If we speak about youth voices, that's one point, but how do minority voices contribute to the European narrative? Do they contribute at all? Why is there a necessity of including them? How should they be included? And B, whilst reflecting on that, I'd also be again interested in hearing a little bit more about the work that you do with regard to that. I mean, many of you are related to working with minorities. With you, it's obvious you work with, as you said, with many different minorities. You, Mr. Niedermüller, work closely with the Jewish community, but also with others. You are engaged with civil liberties. You just recently also visited Israel, which might also be actually an interesting experience to relate to. And Alina, we do that work together. We, as Alfie said, we work with different communities, with the Roma, with the LGBTQI, with in that sense, even intersectional approaches. So why the minority voices? Why minority voices in that parliament, in the European bubble? What do they contribute? And maybe we start with you, Mr. Peter. Sorry, Peter. We're on first name basis.
You know, as I said, we have some problem. If we are talking about minority groups, then I have to put the question, who is the majority? Because, you know, let us say in the 1950s or 60s, it was relatively easy because everybody told you, in London, for example, or in New York or in Berlin, there is a white majority and we have different groups and they are the minorities. But today it's not the case. We are a kind of cultural diversity. And I think so in the frame of this cultural diversity, it's for me very difficult to say that you are the minority and I am the majority. Because this is, of course, a power relation. You know, if I'm saying I'm the majority and you are the minority, then this is an other constellation, other power constellation. And therefore, I think so. I do not like very much this discussion about who is the minority and special minority rights. I think it's very, very important to say that all human beings have the same right. And I do not like to say you have less or more or I don't know what. This is not a question of how many, you know. I think so it's absolutely crucial. Therefore, I don't understand this whole debate just now about political correctness and what's all the craziness from Donald Trump and other Marine Le Pen. This is difficult to listen to her in the parliament, I have to say to you. So I think so we need a new approach to that issue. And I think so we have to understand that today's society, the late modern society, is based on cultural diversity. And it makes no sense to think about what the white working class is going to do. The working class is sometimes green or I don't know, any other color. So this is, I think so, a discourse which brings us in a bad direction. We have to see that, I'm saying again, I'm repeating, that the current society is an absolutely cultural diversity. This is what, and therefore I think so, and I am repeating it again, all human beings have the same rights, and our duty is just to help them to use the rights and to live with their rights. And I think so this is the most important point in the European Parliament as well.
Thank you very much. Very strong words. Peter, Alfiaz.
Well, I take exception to, not to Peter's words, I agree 100% with Peter's words, but when you talk about, you know, and I completely agree with you here, I take exception with the way it's been framed, that, you know, now we suddenly have to reach out to white working class voters, as though they're the only groups. I think when we look at it in terms of minority, majority, we run into these problems. And for me, as a minority, I'm a little bit afraid when we keep on saying that now we have to pander to the white working class, the people who elected the likes of Trump, Le Pen, and everyone else. I mean, the people who are the protagonists of this, now we have to somehow cater to their views and forget about the views of the minorities. And that's why I really agree with Peter that we need to stop thinking of it as majority-minority. Having said that, how do we get the voices of minorities into the parliament, into the EU? First of all, I think we need to have more diversity and representation of minorities in this house and in institutions. Unfortunately, I think in this particular house, we have a lack of diversity, yet we're trying to set the standards of diversity. How does that make any young minority individual, or whatever age they are, feel as though they're welcome here? I mean, we need to see how we can increase, and maybe it's to do with lists in elections and stuff, how we can get, you know, more minorities. We've done this with gender. We've managed to make sure that gender becomes a mainstreamed issue that, you know, is taken up across the political spectrum. So how do we do this with minorities? The other thing I would say is that, you know, the European Union in particular has direct competence when it comes to discrimination and racism. So the minorities have a big voice here because legislation that happens here directly affects them. So we need to make sure that their voices are heard, and that, you know, too often than not, and I think we'll both agree here, that we are initiating legislation that's for minorities, but we don't take into account the views of the minority. And that's happening in the European Commission, where too often we're seeing that, you know, the voices of Roma, the voices of Muslims, the voices of Jewish people, of LGBTI, any group are not being heard. And the reason for that, I say, is that because sometimes what we hear from them is too difficult for us to accept. And therefore, our response is that, instead of taking that on board, we just kind of put them away from the system because they're telling us stuff that we don't want to hear, because it's not politically acceptable right now for our politicians to be defending those rights. And that's where we need strong voices like Peter, who are willing to speak out, no matter what what other political leaders are saying, to speak out for the rights of minorities. But to do that, I think we need to make sure we have the voices of minorities here at the table. And that's why it's important that we have things like this today, and make sure that the voices aren't only at the table, but then incorporated into legislation and policies.
Alina?
Yes, if there is anything to add. I don't know, I think it's incredible that we even have to ask this question still, whether there is value in having an inclusive Europe where minorities are heard. I mean, even through the sheer force of millions of examples, this is very obvious. I think it's been impressive to see this cooperation between the Jewish community and the Roma community, interfaith dialogue, and so on. I think we all have a lot to learn from each other, and it also puts our own perspective into perspective, in the sense that we sometimes expect others to know very much about the Jewish community, to be aware of our issues, to be very careful with what they speak, and so on. And at the same time, in these contexts, we realize how little we might know about other cultures. And I think it's quite a humbling experience, and also an experience that reminds us to engage with anyone who at least is open to learning more, with an open heart, and without any negative attitude and any expectations from them to have known more than they do.
I would like to just say two very quick things. Demographics are changing, and demographics are favoring the side of the progressive voice. I mean, just look across Europe. I mean, our societies are changing. They're becoming more diverse, ethnically, religiously, culturally. So we need to make sure as minorities, and I speak here not as someone working in the parliament, as a minority, that we get our act together, that, we show that we have political value, that, politicians, it's in the politicians' interest for political votes to, take up our issue. I mean, I'm making it, very superficial here, but that is the kind of thing we need to do. And the second thing is, and this is where I'm very concerned, is that we have outstanding MEPs and politicians who are supporting us, but we need to repay their trust, because if you see what happened in the US elections, Trump got more of a percentage from the Afro-American community and from Latinos than John McCain and Mitt Romney. So how come it is that our minorities are also not understanding what's at stake for them? And you know what? If we're not going to act as a minority, then we're going to lose supporters in these institutions who are fighting for us, because we're not, we're not encouraging the good work they're doing, because we're going to then vote for, the likes of Trump, the likes of Le Pen. I mean, it's very paradoxical that we're voting for people who are inflicting harm upon us, you could say. So we need to also make sure that, we make the message clear to minorities that there's something for us to do in this house, but that needs to be replicated by the communities themselves at home and in the way they vote.
Two last questions. One to you, Alina, as a representative of our group, and a very short one to everyone, okay? Alina, what does it mean to be a Jewish activist? What does that even mean?
Well, that is a good question, because I feel that this description of being an activist is somehow both new and very old to me, in the sense that to some extent I've always felt like an activist, but this professional new nuance is something that I'm still getting accustomed to. I would say that as a young Jewish person, I have always, by default, to some extent, felt like an activist, in the sense that, being a minority, I always had to be somewhat of an ambassador, of my Jewish background. And this was never, in my case, it was never negative. I haven't experienced anti-Semitism that I am aware of. I think sometimes we are not even aware of when it happens, but I've never gone through any negative experiences. But of course, a lot of people with a quite shallow knowledge of Judaism, of secular Jewishness, and so on, often had a lot of questions, and in this sense, I've always felt like a bit of an activist. And I think this might be the case for any young Jewish person.
So you're not only a religious activist, but there's also a political connotation to it, if I understand you correctly.
Yes, I mean, there could be neither, there could be both. Of course, as a Jewish person, you are often put in the position of somehow relating to the state of Israel. Oftentimes, you end up being more of an advocate than you would normally be, maybe in your private life, because you do so in antithesis to someone whose opinion is often more negative than yours, and so on. So, yeah, it's quite a challenge to be put in this situation without actively wanting that.
The final, thank you very much, Alina. The final question, a very short one. I know we're all involved in politics. We all speak a lot, but that one shouldn't take more than one word to answer. Very easy. Despite the fact that we're in the Christmas season, and this actually is our Hanukkah and Christmas special of EUJS TV, the question is as follows: falafel or bagels with schmear and salmon? Falafel or bagels? Who wants to go first? Alfie.
Falafel.
Falafel? Peter?
Bagels.
Bagels, okay.
Falafels win.
So I think we're going to have a few falafels for the Christmas and Hanukkah season. Thank you guys so much for watching. Tune in next time for episode 3 of EUJS TV in February. Thank you all so much for visiting us here in Brussels, to the J Academy crowd. Thank you to the AJC Translating Institute for hosting us. RD, you, Mr. Peter Niedermüller. Alina, obviously, for the tremendous work you've also put in setting up this program. Thank you all for the work you do, for having been with us here today, and most importantly, well, happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, and happy Kwanzaa, or whatever it is you're celebrating. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Thanks.